I'm Phil Martin. I'm a 28-year-old adult on the autism spectrum. So I was diagnosed with autism after my fourth or third year of ninth grade in the Prince George's County school system in Maryland. Um, Starting off in high school, it was, well, backing up a little farther, my entire school life, there was a problem. There was always a known problem. Um, I had anxiety attacks almost every day, knowing that I had to walk into the classroom, knowing I had to interact with other people. But it didn't become a huge issue until I started high school. So I started high school at Eleanor Roosevelt in Greenbelt. And, I was excited. This was a big thing. It was like high school was like the first steps of becoming an adult. And I was interested to see how it was going to go. So I remember my first few days in high school. I remember thinking to myself, "This is horrible." Like there was so much going on. There were so many people. Um, like I just couldn't do it. I physically didn't feel as if I could do it. I didn't eat the food that they served there. I wasn't interested in eating the food they served. I wasn't interested in making friends or communicating with anybody there, and it was overwhelming. So um, my comfort was always trains. So I remember every day my mother would leave for work, and I would get on the metro bus, and I would attempt to go to school, and I would ride right past the school on the metro bus and continue on to the metro station, where I would then literally ride metro trains from the time I was supposed to have started school until the time school was over. And then I would, get on that same metro bus to go back home and get off the bus as if I had been in school all day. And I did that for 3 years consistently. And, the school would call my mother, and I would always say, um, "Oh, they must have didn't count me, or they didn't realize I was in the class," or something like that. Um, so closer to the end of the third year, I met with the school psychologist because they wanted to know why I had repeated the ninth grade so many times. And so I was sitting in the meeting with her. I remember she looked at me. I remember her name, and I'll say her name. Her name was Dr. Lee Rothman. It's pretty bold to put her name out there, but I remember she looked me right in my eye, and she said, "Well," at this point I was about 15 or 16. She was like, "Well, since you love trains so much," she said, "why don't you drop out and go drive a train? Maybe that'll work better for you. Maybe school isn't for you." And I was confused as to why she was telling me this, because I know I wanted to be in school. It was just extremely difficult for me to function in this setting with hundreds of children, hundreds of other kids I don't know, and hundreds of other emotions, and it was just too much for me. And I was confused as to why she was saying that. So my mother got wind of the fact that she said that, because my mother was in the meeting, but it didn't process right then and there, and we talked about it later. So my mother went to the school board, and she wanted to know why her, teenage son was being told to drop out of school to pursue a dream that isn't really, achievable without an education. So after my mother went to the school board, um, the school wanted me to get tested for every developmental disorder they could test me for, and so I spent a few weeks going to see therapists and psychiatrists and psychologists at the University of Maryland. It was very frustrating because I did not enjoy talking about my feelings. I did not enjoy being videotaped as we talked about stuff, but I know it needed to be done. So at the end of the day, they diagnosed me with Asperger's syndrome, ADHD, agoraphobia, and schoolphobia. And the reason they diagnosed me with agoraphobia is because they assumed that me not wanting to leave the house and interact with people was a fear of outdoors, but that wasn't the case. And the reason they diagnosed me with school phobia is because of the panic attacks I would have when I would walk into the school and I would see all these people. But after further tests is when they determined that it was just all Asperger's syndrome. And it had been Asperger's syndrome all along. And that for 3 years, I had been suffering in my schoolwork and suffering educational wise because they just wrote it off as another black kid that didn't want to be a part of the school system, because you didn't have to look far for that, honestly, when I was 16, growing up in Prince George's County. So the school, as an apology, the school then put me in a secondary school, a special education school that was um, able to handle children on the autism spectrum in Prince George's County, and that's where my life began to turn around. So when I started the new school is where I started to notice a change in my own behavior towards having autism. The school was a smaller setting. It was about 8 to 10 students per classroom. It was the desks were cubicle style, so I wasn't able to see the person to my left or the person to my right. So it kind of helped you focus, take your mind off of the people around you and helped you focus on your own work. You didn't face the teacher; you actually faced away from the teacher. You actually faced a wall, so you were kind of secluded almost. That helped a lot. That helped with me trying to get out of school. That helped with me focusing on my studies. Helped me focusing on schoolwork. A part of that school they also did was they gave all the students jobs and they paid us. It was really interesting. So, the students, they handled the lunch and they did, the cleaning and, the students worked in the school basically. And that way it was to teach them responsibility and to teach them how, real world things, what happens after you graduate from high school. But the only thing is with that concept is it also it hindered me a little bit, I believe, because you know you spend 4 years in that school and they're teaching you, this is how things are going to be once you graduate. But one thing they don't prepare you for is the fact that once you leave this building, is almost no one's going to understand autism. Almost no one's going to understand who you are or how things are more difficult for you. And that was a big thing. And there was a wake up call. It was, I walked out of the school and I walked across the stage with my diploma and I was ready to hit the world thinking that, everything's going to be okay. Wrong. Uh, it wasn't immediately okay. I began working immediately after high school as an EMT. Um, it started off great, but I struggled with, interacting with numerous people. I struggled with expressing myself and reading facial expressions um, and maintaining relationships and friendships. It was a big thing. One of the things about being on the autism spectrum is that um, there's a strange diet, I guess you can say, a very closed diet. I grew up eating grilled cheese, chicken tenders, cheeseburgers, hot dogs. Those are the same foods I eat now. And it's very difficult to introduce a new food into my diet because I just can't. I don't know what it is. I don't know what is going on mentally where I just can't do it. But there's like different food textures and it's difficult. And a lot of parents ask me, it was like, is my son ever going to eat more than just, a grilled cheese? And I'm like, it's patience because, you know, um, I was in a relationship with someone and I ended up being introduced to stuff like baked chicken and grilled chicken, stuff that I didn't think I would ever want to eat, and broccoli and just different foods were introduced. But it took a long time. It was definitely over time. But because there was all these years of that poor diet, I deal with a lot of gastric issues now. So a lot of abdominal pain, a lot of stomach aches because of all those years of that poor diet. But that relationship where the person I was in a relationship with was introducing me to those diets, that was a big part of my life. That was a big improvement, a big milestone that was reached. Um, I was in that relationship for about 6 years with a young lady who she she tried more than anyone I've ever met to understand what it was for me on the autism spectrum. She always always put my feelings before hers, or my emotions before hers, and that was a big thing because I didn't think I would find someone that would do that. I didn't think that existed, but it's overwhelming, when you're in your early 20s and you're dating someone on the autism spectrum that you have to, you know, eh, now I don't want to say it's almost like having a second child or having a child, but it's definitely it's a lot of work, and I don't think our attitudes really were intact too much because the relationship fell apart like most of the relationships I've been in through my life. Like it's unable to be sustained because it's difficult dating someone on the autism spectrum. But there's hope. It's as long as the person cares and they love you and they'll do the research and they'll understand, then everything is going to be okay. Patience is a big key to a healthy, happy relationship with someone on the autism spectrum. Um, but during that relationship, a lot of my stress didn't even come from the relationship. It came from my full time job. At that point, I was an emergency dispatcher, and it was the worst job I probably had. I worked in a place that didn't really embrace autism. They didn't really care that I was on the spectrum. So therefore, certain things, certain sensory issues that I dealt with, they didn't acknowledge, like the loud noises and the sensitivity to touch. It was a non-factor to them. It was no matter how many interviews I had done or how many articles they had read about me, and my high sensitivity to sound and touch, they still did it. They still made sure they would talk really loud towards me to make me feel uncomfortable. Um, touching me when knowing that I didn't want to be touched, or even it was a painful time. It was almost like it was like what I expected high school to be like, but as an adult with a full time job, this was now happening. Like the bullying that I expected all through high school was happening now, and that was a big thing. And but it was through that I needed to find a healthy outlet, so I began interest in photography, and it was just a way for me to try to unwind after dealing with stress. And I was originally inspired by a gentleman based out of New York named John DeGuzman. And John shot real time photography and he posted it to Instagram as he took the picture. So I could, in DC, be looking at exactly, what John's commute looked like, or, where he's going for lunch. And he would do it in such a way that it was art. And that inspired me. And so I began to photograph around DC. I began to take pictures on my iPhone 4, those horrible low quality images, and I just started taking pictures. And um, my mother got really sick and ended up to it led up to her passing away. And I did a project on her last few weeks of life. The images weren't really great. I really just got a camera and I was really still understanding the camera, but it was what I was capturing is what a lot of people found interesting, and it was her. It was this was I captured the decline of her health, and I shared it. I held it in VSCO, which some people call Visco, but I don't because there's no I in there. But VSCO is a company that deals with photography related tools, and they were releasing a platform which they call the Journal. So I held my project until the Journal came live, and I released it, and it was positive feedback from every person that saw it, and that led to companies starting to pay attention to me, and more people started to ask me about being on the autism spectrum, and then more people started asking me about how it is to be a photographer on the autism spectrum. So that led to me getting a lot of the work that I think I got, because that put me on a level where I could be seen. And even though the project wasn't in reference to autism, it now gave me a platform to use to talk about autism. And I was still working for that same employer. And I remember I had a conversation with someone, and she said to me, she said, "You're not autistic." And I was explaining to her that there's different levels of the spectrum. There's high and there's low, and there's everyone is different. And she swore up and down. She told me, she looked me right in my face, and she said, "You are not autistic." And that really upset me, because she didn't know the struggle I had went through elementary school, through middle school, the bullying, the horrible path I had to walk to get to where I was. And so that led me to do a project called Autism Actually Speaks, which I partnered with Autism Speaks to locate people on the spectrum and just share their stories. And so I met with 4 people, around the country, and I shared their story on a platform just to show that, you know, all these people are doing amazing things and they're autistic, and that doesn't hold them back. So autism, you can't look at one person and say, oh, I can tell he has autism, and then like, because that doesn't happen with me. You can't look at me and tell me I have autism. So being a guy, a male on the autism spectrum, like most boys with autism, you know, they're attracted to trains. Trains are very interesting to them because, for several reasons, for me, and I'll speak on my behalf only, trains, they don't deviate from their path, usually. There's a time, there's a set schedule. They run at a set time. You know that train's going to come every day at 3 o'clock. You know how many cars it's going to be. You know it's not going to deviate from that plan. So as a child, my goal, my biggest goals, have been to work for Amtrak, as well as the local metro system in Washington D.C. And in 2015, I was able to accomplish one of those goals by becoming a freelance photographer for Amtrak, and that was a huge deal, not only for me, but a huge deal for people with autism who might have those same goals, those same dreams, and they feel like those dreams aren't achievable because I felt like it wasn't achievable. And when Amtrak called me, they called me 3 days before Thanksgiving in 2015, and they said, hey, can you come to Union Station in DC tomorrow, and can you get on a train and can you photograph the holiday rush? They was like, we're looking for a cover photo. We need a cover photo for our Amtrak Inc. magazine, and we just need someone to go out there and just find us a cover photo. And literally the first picture I took on the platform at Washington Union Station was the photo used for the cover photo. And that was a big deal for me. And from there, I've now gone across the country, again, working for Amtrak as a freelance photographer. That's a big deal. You know, like a lot of people that on the spectrum that love trains, like some of them don't even know that the images they're looking at sometimes were captured by someone who's also on the autism spectrum. I feel like that's a huge thing. After the relationship I was in for 6 years ended, I met another young lady who was a photographer. It was a very amazing, a very smart, talented woman, and we really hit it off. And in 2015, we welcomed our son into the world, and that was a big thing for not only for me, but I've now learned for a lot of parents to know that, you know, it's a possibility for someone on the autism spectrum to have a family, you know, to be an adult with a job and that's taking care of a family. Like it was a big thing. It was a big thing to have a son, and I love my son to death. But there's also a fear of what is going to happen if my autism affects me being a great parent. What's going to happen when it's bring your parent to school day or career day, and my son says, hey dad, can you come and talk about something? And, you know, I get nervous or I have an anxiety attack because of all of the different people I have to interact with and all of the different facial expressions I have to try to process. Like what's going to happen when that happens? What's going to happen when I'm at a point where I'm overly flustered and I just can't function? Or what's going to happen if my son, you know, triggers some of my sensory issues? Like that scares me. It scares me a lot, but I think it's going to be okay. At the end of the day, I think that my goal is, although I'm someone that's on the higher end of the autism spectrum, my goal is that someone who is also on the spectrum, who has dreams of achieving certain things, will see this, and they will know that they can accomplish what they want to do.